Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee. Today is Wednesday, March 11, 2026. Unfortunately, my co-host Olivia Lane is unable to be with us today. She is not feeling well, so definitely praying for you, Olivia, hoping that you feel better very soon so that you can get back into the studio with me as soon as possible. But today, we're going to continue our coverage of the war in Iran. I appreciate some listener feedback and some audience questions we've gotten over the past week or so. People seem to have a few questions about the war, and they're not so much on the technical side of things, more so why are we at war in the first place, and trying to understand that angle of the news coverage. So we're going to focus on that a bit today and try to unpack some of the questions that I've been getting either in person or online from some of our listeners, and hope to provide you some additional things to think about in terms of why this war is happening in the first place and what it means for the U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, I will note before jumping into this that if you look at many polls, right now Americans are somewhat divided on this issue. It's safe to say that if you voted for President Trump, you're probably very supportive of this war in Iran. It's safe to say that if you did not vote for President Trump, you're likely to be a bit more skeptical, of course. So this is typical of our current state of polarization in American politics. But what's interesting is even those who believe that the war in Iran should be happening are perhaps a little bit confused still about what we're fighting for exactly. So today we're going to jump into, like I said, a bit of why this war is happening in the first place and try to tackle some of those questions. First question that we've received recently is very simply, why does America have skin in the game? Or why are we, the United States, fighting this war and not just Israel? I think this is an excellent question. I'd like to give you a few different things to think about. First of all, I do want to acknowledge that there's been some ambiguity about the ultimate objectives of the war in Iran and how we will know, the United States, that we've won the war or that we have accomplished enough. It's safe to say that is probably part of this strategy, because one thing that has become relatively clear about the Trump administration is that ambiguity about timelines and objectives and when enough is part of the strategy, essentially. It's a form of psychological warfare that President Trump is rather fond of and is used effectively for his own purposes, I would say. Now, that being said, it can, of course, leave us a little bit confused about what's going on. It's probably part of the reason why we have some of these questions being asked, like, why do we have skin in the game? What's in it for us, essentially? What are we trying to accomplish here? And in order to understand that, I think you have to break the war down into a few different categories. So you have moral reasons for this conflict. You have very practical reasons for the war against Iran. You also have more, let's call it, grand strategic reasons why this war might be fought against Iran. We'll take each of those in turn and try to give you a couple of examples. First, what are the moral reasons to be fighting a war against Iran right now? For starters, they killed 30,000 protesters, and President Trump promised to send help. So on that basis, President Trump alone might be thinking that he is obligated in some way to send some help, some military assistance to the Iranian people after promising to do so, and in an effort to bring down a very evil regime that would do something like that to its own people in a matter of days earlier this year. The second issue that we have to keep in mind as well when we're thinking about moral reasons for this conflict is that Iran, not Iran so much, but rather the Islamic regime that runs Iran, the country, is a very evil entity. It has an ideology that is inherently violent, inherently invested in a strategy of terrorism, spreading violence and destruction around the Middle East, targeting countries like the United States with that violence and destruction. And for some people, it is a little bit hard to wrap our minds around this. One thing that I heard recently on a different podcast I thought was helpful framing or context from Walter Mead is that most Americans who are under the age of 40, let's say, are relatively unaware of the extent of the violence, destruction, the terrorism that the Iranian regime has engaged in for the last several decades, really, which began in 1979 during the Islamic Revolution. So it would be understandable if most Americans who are thinking about this issue of a certain age don't actually know or understand or have memories of just how evil this Islamic regime is. Now, speaking for myself, I would say, having been to the Middle East several times since October 7, 2023, it's different. it does feel different when you're able to take in firsthand experiences of witnessing or bearing witness to places where this evil has actually been carried out in extremely cruel ways. I'm thinking, for example, of October 7th, 2023. If you've been to any of the places where this attack was carried out against Israel, and you know that Iran is partially responsible for it because of their sponsorship of and support for an organization like Hamas as part of their strategy, then you have a different perspective. I mean, there's just no other way really to put it other than if you haven't been, it's hard to understand. In order to truly understand, you have to see it for yourself to understand the weight, the moral weight, the emotional weight of having seen up close and personal what that kind of evil looks like and what kind of destruction it can leave behind. So these are some of the moral reasons why the war might be fought against Iran. And I don't want to give the impression that these are the primary reasons because I don't think they actually are for President Trump and this administration, but it's worth thinking about these issues. And one of the reasons why, personally, I think it's good that we are at war against Iran right now because there is an evil that needs to be confronted. Now, on to some of the reasons why U.S. administration is more likely to have engaged in this conflict or reasons that are more likely to play into their calculus, the practical ones. Everyone understands very well, I think, that a nuclear weapon for Iran can't happen. This has been the policy of many U.S. presidents and their administrations going back for several decades. And the problem that people are wrestling with right now, that the United States and Israel continue to wrestle with even after the war last June, is that Iran does still have nuclear material. It is not enriched yet to the level necessary to produce a nuclear weapon, but it could very quickly be enriched to that level. It is buried, yes, as a result of last year's operation, but technically still accessible if they were to excavate certain sites, which are now buried deep underground due to the massive airstrikes last June. What that means then is that the nuclear program for Iran was not totally destroyed, and this was admitted last year after the operation, but rather set back a period of several years. Given time to rebuild, it could have been rebuilt, and we could have been right back where we started in a matter of a couple of years, maybe not even that, if Iran had managed to access this nuclear material and restart their program. That's a very practical reason why a war like this needs to happen, because that cannot be allowed to happen, that Iran would have a nuclear weapon as long as they are chanting genocidal slogans like death to Israel, death to America, and things of these nature. The ballistic missile program is also a problem for a couple of reasons, regardless of whether you put a nuclear warhead on these ballistic missiles. The ballistic missile program by itself is terribly lethal. It doesn't need a nuclear warhead to be very dangerous, especially if you are adding any chemical components or if you are using them with warheads built with cluster munitions as they have in Israel recently. They can be very, very dangerous, just all by themselves. They don't need a nuclear warhead to be dangerous and to have a very terrible impact. It's also important to note that the Iranians have made no secret of their plans to put into operation versions that could hit the continental United States. They haven't done so yet, but they claim to have either been in the process of or getting ready to test a version which could hit the east coast of the United States. This would be known as an intercontinental ballistic missile, which would be a massive leap forward for the Iranian program, but one that they're very serious about achieving with or without a nuclear warhead to put on that missile. So again, even the missiles without the warheads are reason enough, practically speaking, where we have to take the Iranian threat seriously. Now, the other layer to this is that the ballistic missiles are not just dangerous for their own sake, but they are also a significant obstacle to the United States from preventing them, the Iranians, from getting a nuclear weapon in the future. Because the ballistic missile program has been intentionally designed in such a way that it puts a very high price on any sort of military confrontation with Iran, either by contributing to U.S. casualties or in an effort to hurt U.S. allies or shutting down international shipping routes in the Strait of Hormuz, things like that. The ballistic missile program is something that could have been used and was designed to be used to basically act as a deterrent against United States military action. Now, after the war last year, the ballistic missile program was smaller than it had been previously, which gave the United States and Israel a window of opportunity to go back to war before it was too late. Because if the ballistic missile program became too large, then the math would no longer be in our favor. What do I mean by that? Well, right now, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that the United States interceptor stock is not necessarily large enough to intercept every Iranian ballistic missile. at the moment, it's not a deterrent, obviously, against going to war against Iran, because the belief is that we can destroy the production facilities, missiles themselves, or the launchers on the ground before they can shoot all those ballistic missiles, and we're required to use all of our interceptors. However, that's only true if the ballistic missile program size, storage, production sites, launchers, are of a small enough size that we can deal with them before they are launched and then pose a real threat to our interceptors and our troops on the ground in the Middle East. So, all that to say, there are good reasons why the clock was ticking, and given Iran's pace of rebuilding its ballistic missile program, something had to be done now, or it was going to be much more costly later, both in terms of U.S. lives, but also in terms of the economic and financial costs of a war in the future. Now, the last thing I'll note, of course, is that another very good practical reason to confront Iran, not just at some point, but now, is that they have created a massive proxy network, as we discussed during last week's episode with Bridget, and are the largest state sponsor of terrorism. Many of their proxies have been weakened over the course of the last 2 years, but are also actively in the process of rebuilding. Hezbollah, for example, has proven to be remarkably effective at launching missiles into central Israel, despite the massive blows that they've taken over the last 2 years in conflict with Israel. So it's clear that, again, there's a limited amount of time to deal with these threats before they become larger and that much harder to deal with. Now, pivoting to the grand strategic reasons for a war with Israel, this is, I think, a very important but often overlooked angle to what's happening in Iran right now. And that is, if you take a step back and think about the globe, if you were, as a chessboard, so to speak, it's not just about Iran, what's happening right now, this war with Iran. There is a bigger picture. There is a much more grand and complicated strategy at work here, it would seem. And the primary reason for that is that the United States is not just in competition with Iran, but also considers it to be part of an axis of resistance that includes Russia and China, two other countries that are significant rivals of the United States, in which we are often experiencing some tension with, if not open competition. Thankfully, recently there has been no open military hostility or conflict with those countries, but there has been a significant degree of competition and the potential for military conflict with them in the future. We have to think seriously about the threat that especially China poses to us in the near future. Many analysts and experts would predict right now that the likelihood of there being some sort of military confrontation with China, either a short or perhaps an extended one, especially over Taiwan or other parts of South Asia, are relatively high in the next 5 to 10 years, potentially. So what does that mean? If we're fighting a war with China in the next 5 to 10 years, we have to think very seriously about what kind of threats it poses and what kind of threats it might be able to pose with 5 to 10 more years of preparation. Realistically, the threat that it would pose is much too large for the United States to confront if it were fighting a multi-front war. So first and foremost, if you're going to face China in the next 5 to 10 years, the United States has to figure out a way to eliminate threats like Iran so that it's not fighting a multi-front war in the next 5 to 10 years, but can fight one enemy at a time. You've seen evidence of this kind of strategy playing out in the way that the United States has gone about reshaping its relationship with the Western Hemisphere. Countries like Venezuela, for example, trying to pull them out of China's orbit back into the U.S. orbit, reducing the potential for conflict in the Western Hemisphere or very close to U.S. borders so that it can focus on threats which are further away, frankly, and focus on one threat at a time. In many ways, what this means, essentially, is that the type of politics and global strategy that you saw at work during the Cold War is returning in some respect. The idea that there are spheres of influence, the idea that you can try to manipulate the board in such a way that you can confront one threat at a time, as opposed to fighting a multi-front war with various proxies between two global superpowers, is essentially what you're seeing at work right now, is the United States recalibrating for that kind of competition with China. Now, Iran is important not just because it aligns itself with China, but also because of where it sits geographically. If you want to fight a war with China in the future, or if you want to engage even in competition with China without having to engage in military conflict with it, you have to think very seriously about how to stabilize and maintain or control over or access to global trade routes. Those are obviously very important in the context of Iran in terms of where it sits, because it sits on the Strait of Hormuz, which is a very crucial energy shipping route out of the Middle East and to Asia and other parts of the world as well. You also have to find a way to minimize China's control over them so that you can control the degree of liability or risk associated with those trade routes. So again, if you look at the big picture, it might seem like this is just another war in the Middle East, another attempt at regime change, and something that people are reasonably skeptical of, I think, given our history of the last 20 to 25 years in the Middle East. But it's not the same war. It's different. There are different reasons why Iran poses a threat to the United States that must be dealt with. There are also different factors at play in terms of global strategy and competition that were not true of previous wars in the Middle East, reasons why this war necessarily needs to be fought in order to secure the United States' interest in national security into the next decade. Now, the other question that we get quite a bit is, did Israel drag the United States into this war? It's a very interesting question. I think I'm fascinated by how often we get some version of this question. It is not necessarily a bad question, but I think it is interesting the different motivations or reasons why people ask the question. Some people are asking this question in good faith, and it's a fair question. Some people are asking this in an attempt to paint Israel as some sort of conspiratorial agent that is controlling the United States and arguing that the United States needs to end its relationship with Israel and no longer be controlled by it. I think this question, if it is being framed in that respect as an argument that the United States needs to end its relationship with Israel, fundamentally misunderstands a couple of things. Number one, how is the decision to go to war actually made? Well, for starters, it's a much more complicated decision than just an ally basically saying that they want you to do something. That's not how the largest power in the world makes the decision to go to war. The United States is still the most powerful country in the world. And typically, when we go to war, there's a few things that we take into consideration. Things like threat. Do we face a threat? In this case, we believe, yes, we did face a threat from Iran, and we're going to face an even greater threat from Iran in the future. Things like a cost-benefit analysis. What do we gain from going to war? And is it going to benefit us more than it is going to cost us in the long run to go to war with Iran? Clearly, right now, the Trump administration thinks that the cost-benefit analysis works in our favor and that we should be at war with Iran. There's also things like opportunity. Is the time right? Is there enough intelligence? Do we have the amount of materials in place necessary to go to war? And these are the kinds of things that you saw at play or being worked out, wrestled over the past couple of months. Because remember, President Trump promised the Iranian protesters almost immediately after the massacres began that he was sending help and that help was on the way. So he was going to rescue them by providing some military support. That support did not arrive immediately. It took quite a bit of time. And the reason why is because President Trump had to ensure the right materials and resources were in place, the right personnel, the right military equipment and hardware. Also had to find the right opportunity, the right time, waiting for intelligence to tell him when is the right time to actually strike against Iran. Not an easy decision to make necessarily. But these are the kinds of things that have to be taken into consideration. And finally, political support. I mean, let's be very blunt and honest. U.S. presidents do not go to war, particularly in the Middle East, unless they feel that they have enough political cover to do so and political support to do so. President Trump appears, based on the recent polling, to have made the right decision that he does have the political support necessary for this war. But Israel is not going to be able to force him to go to a war that is going to harm his prospects politically, especially in a midterm year. Don't forget, this is an election year, and politics matter even more than usual right now in terms of whether we go to war or not. Allies do matter, yes, but they are not the only consideration. I think it's also important to note that President Trump has done a lot for Israel, does have a very good relationship with Israel, but has also repeatedly restrained them, expressed some frustration, and asked them to either adapt their strategy or to stop shooting altogether when he feels like the time has come for them to stop. So if you look at who's actually calling the shots in this relationship between the United States and Israel, I would say it seems pretty clear to me that President Trump has far more influence over Israel than Israel has over his decision-making process. And this question, again, just sort of fundamentally misunderstands or makes some false assumptions about how decisions to go to war are made by any U.S. administration. Now, I also want to clarify, I don't think that this question takes into account all of the historical context or reasons why this administration and President Trump especially has decided to go to war against Iran. President Trump has been speaking about how dangerous Iran is for many years. I mean, it was a part of his first campaign back in 2016 and again in 2020 and again in 2024. He's giving speeches during all of these campaigns basically saying that he felt the need to eventually confront Iran, that there was going to be the need for something to give. That Iran was going to have to surrender to his demands in negotiations, or there was going to be a confrontation with Iran over those issues. It's not news. It shouldn't be news to anyone that President Trump feels this way about Iran and has been predicting a moment like this for many years. Iran also made matters worse by trying to assassinate President Trump. If you want to pick a fight with the leader of the free world, the best way to do it is to threaten to kill him and then engage in various plots to do so. President Trump also made it very clear a couple of months ago that he was seeking a diplomatic solution that would not require military confrontation, but he also laid out very clear terms for those negotiations and a deadline. And if you follow his work closely, if you studied the lead up to even the war in Iran last June, it's very similar. I mean, President Trump means it when he says that these are the terms for the negotiations, these are the deadlines to finish the negotiations. If the terms and deadline are not met, there will be a military confrontation. He means it. I mean, I think we should take him seriously at this point, that he has made very clear what his criteria are, what his process is for reaching a decision to go to war. And he's followed that path multiple times now against Iran. Last thing I'll say on this is that the United States has been very carefully planning this war for years. If you've listened to, there's been a number of different podcasts out recently. School of War, for example, is a good one, where you have former officials, especially former commanders of Central Command, on these podcasts giving interviews, talking about the war in Iran. And one thing that's clear repeatedly is that people have been planning this war either in the national security establishment or in Central Command specifically for many years, even before President Trump. Individuals have been recognizing the potential threat that Iran poses and planning military scenarios to eventually confront Iran if necessary. The United States has been doing this since long before Israel suggested that a coordinated campaign against Iran would be a good idea. And to assume that Israel dragged the U.S. into this against our will or forced us to do something that we didn't want to do ourselves or wouldn't have eventually done by ourselves anyway is, I think, a mistaken assumption, something that we need to think carefully about in terms of where is this question coming from? What is the motive or the agenda behind people who are pushing this question? Now, the last question I'll cover very briefly is what have we learned about the U.S.-Israel relationship during the course of this war? We are shifting into an era, of course, where shared strategic interests and not necessarily shared values are going to be the determining factor in terms of how close the U.S.-Israel relationship is. And that is disconcerting to a certain degree because shared interests are less reliable than shared values. Realistically, if you look at where American politics are going today, it seems pretty clear that the current trends, at least, are more interested in shared strategic interests than they are in shared values between the United States and Israel. Interests and strategy in the course of this war may not be totally aligned, but they are awfully close. Very, very close. The United States has really perhaps never this closely coordinated a military campaign with one of its allies. And it's very obvious, even just the fact that the two countries whose names are spoken at the same time by Iran, death to America, death to Israel, are the United States and Israel. We're the only two countries that Iran likes to threaten with death and destruction at the same time. So obviously our shared interests are very closely aligned in this situation. Again, not totally aligned, but very closely aligned in the sense that we are trying to confront a genocidal enemy. Israel is also, I think, over the course of this war, proving itself to be not only one of the allies whose interests are closest to ours, but also one of the most right now. There's been a lot of writing and discussion over this over the last week and a half, but it's pretty remarkable how much Israel has been able to accomplish and how much the United States has been able to accomplish with Israel's coordination and assistance over the course of the last 12 days. Various officials, including those, by the way, who are in the more restraintist or isolationist camp of American foreign policy, have openly admitted that Israel is essentially the model ally for the United States. It is what everyone in the Trump administration who considers themselves an isolationist wishes that NATO allies could or would be, for example. They have crazy technology. They have crazy intelligence. They have remarkable fighting skills. They have courage. They have a will to fight that, frankly, many of America's other allies don't seem to right now. They don't simply take from the United States. They give back. They share all of the above with the United States, and they fight. And they fight really well. They win. They're very effective. And that's an important thing to note about what the future of this relationship might look like and how it might shape American foreign policy more generally. Again, if the current trends continue and the United States continues to look for more allies like this, Israel has given other potential U.S. allies a model to follow, something that I think is going to be studied more and more closely over the next few years. Now, all that to say, I also want to acknowledge that that's never going to be enough for some people. Some people will continue to be critical of the U.S.-Israel relationship, to argue that it is bad for the United States or that Israel is still somehow acting in an inappropriate manner by seeking this kind of relationship with the U.S. I think at some point Israel is going to, and arguably already has begun the process of thinking long and hard about whether it's worth trying to change people's minds or whether it needs to think more so in terms of building its independence from the United States from a defense industrial base standpoint and its ability to continue fighting with or without the assistance and the support of the United States. If Israel decides that it needs to become more independent, I just want to note that that probably stands to hurt the United States just as much, if not more so, than Israel. Because we're a massive country, yes, but we have relied on Israel in very significant ways over the last couple of decades in the war on terror, either for their intelligence or for some of their technology, life-saving technology, like missile defense, air defenses, improvements to our own fighter jet, the F-35. The list goes on and on. So it's possible that Israel could be so turned off by the criticism coming against it from the let's call it the new right, or whatever you want to call it, that it decides that it needs to be more independent and less dependent on the United States. And if that were the case, again, I think that would also hurt the United States, not just Israel. And we need to be very, very careful about allowing ourselves to walk down that path. We'll go ahead and close now, and we'll leave a few other things for next week's conversation when hopefully Olivia will be back with us. I just want to close with a note on how you can be praying for the situation. And we've mentioned this a few times, but I think it is important to keep coming back to the same issues that we pray for whenever there is a conflict like this. One, it is very important to pray for the safety of civilians and innocent people in the Middle East. War is ugly. It is terrible. It is a necessary evil, but it has very high costs. And we need to be praying for the people who are required to bear the burden of paying those costs in terms of risk and violence, destruction, loss of life, all of those things. We pray for them, for their safety, also for their comfort. We pray, of course, for the safety of the IDF and the U.S. military who are fighting against Iran today. We pray for an end to this conflict that is lasting, that is sustainable, that is peaceful, and that is just. And we would ask you to all be praying for the same. We don't have great answers for you right now in terms of how much longer this is going to last, but we ask you to pray that it would end, and that when it ends, that it ends with a lasting, peaceful, and just solution to this conflict and to the evil that the Islamic regime represents. And thank you very much for listening today. Thank you to Lindsay as well for producing this episode. And Olivia, if you're listening to this, hope you feel better very soon. We look forward to having you back next week for our next episode, hopefully. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.